Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 48 of season 1. It's also part 13 of my series on the Hoysala dynasty, the concluding part on this dynasty. In the last episode, I walked you through the end of the reign of Veera Ballala II and the reigns of Narasimha and his son Someshwara. We left off where Someshwara, unable to hold an empire together, split the Hoysala kingdom in two. He crowned his son Narasimha III as king of the northern part, with his headquarters in Dorasamudra, which is present-day Halebeedu, and his son Ramanatha as king of the South Empire, with his capital at Kannur, which is in present-day Tamil Nadu. And in this episode, we will pass over these kings, dive into the reign of the last king, Veera Ballala III, and see the dynasty fall to the Delhi Sultanate. And as always, there's so much human interest in history, if one only stopped to feel the romance in it. But before I stop to feel anything, first a word of thanks to my corporate sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose generosity makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. In the decade or so between 1254, when Narasimha III had split his kingdom, and 1263, which is definitely the last estimated year of his death, he decided to spend his time with his son Ramanatha in Kannur. But after he died at the hands of Sundara Pandya, Kannur was no longer Ramanatha's domain. It has been said that he got to share it with Sundara Pandya, but it is more likely that he was eventually put to flight. There are not many points in history where anything good came out of the splitting of an empire between siblings, and the Hoysala kingdom was no exception. For one, the kingdom had been fractured by design, and if that was not bad enough, Ramanatha had got the share of the kingdom that had been routed and occupied by the Pandyas. And all this was at the height of the Pandya rise. To give you a sense of the scope of the problem, the Pandyas were on a rampage. Jatavarmans had stormed into Chola territory aggressively. Rajendra Chola III's government had collapsed, and the Chola identity was for all purposes dissolved into the Pandya kingdom. And then one after another, the Kadavas, the Telugu Cholas of Nellore, and the Kakatiyas, and even the Yadavas fell to his advance. The entire Tamil region and parts of Telugu lands came under Pandya rule. Sundara Pandya's conquest, which had begun with Kerala and Sri Lanka, continued at grand scale. With all this, he was able to assert his presence. He showered the great temples with a vast share of his vast wealth. From Srirangam in the south to Nellore in the north, he left behind at least 20 inscriptions in Sanskrit and Tamil, each offering a vivid account of his successes. And then, Sundara Pandya, in a grand display of triumph, had himself weighed against gold while seated in royal splendor on top of an elephant. Ramanatha did not stand much of a chance of regaining his seat of power, and this would be lost to him forever. Leaving his beloved Kannur, he moved his capital near Bangalore, more specifically Kundana, which is in Devanahalli. It's about 35 kilometers straight north of the city, past the new airport. This location has been disputed and alternate locations suggested, such as Malur and Kolar, but there's no hard evidence on any of this. Kundana sports a fort which is visible even today. It's called the Kundana Betta or the Kundana Fort. It's a small fort on a hill overlooking the whole area. But this would have afforded the beleaguered Ramanatha some protection, not only from the Pandyas, but also from a section of the Vaishnava clergy at Srirangam who had felt abandoned by the Hoysalas. You remember, Vishnuvardhana had forsworn Jainism for Vaishnavism, but Ramanatha's grandfather Someshwara had long embraced Shaivism, and that had stayed a family faith since then. So the Vaishnavas took to issuing inscriptions decrying the Shaiva Someshwara's reign and praising Sundara Pandya. For example, the Ranganatha inscription discovered in Srirangam read, "Having caused a person to long for death, that the moon of Karnataka brought the lotus pond of Srirangam to a sorrowful state. But having restored it to Lakshmi, the goddess worshipped in all three worlds, King Sundara Pandya rose in full splendor like the sun. This has all the trappings of a classic Shaiva-Vaishnava ego clash, but this caused Ramanatha considerable stress. It must be remembered that choice of faith may have been a personal choice, but it wasn't a simple choice. Back then, there was no separation of religion and state, or church and state by the cliché, and the power of religions was deeply connected to the patronage of kings. So although kings were famously secular for the most part, a king's professed faith was of prime importance in the land. It would have made his adoptive credo powerful. Nonetheless, the matter of faith back then was so strong that it was not just stress that was a cost to Ramanatha. Soon enough, the Pandyas had reinstated him, but to the island of Srirangam. And judging by inscriptions, it is clear that the price of peace would have included Ramanatha adopt the Vaishnava faith. And now at this time, he could enjoy the silence of peace with the remnants of his old buddies the Choras, who had been subsumed into the Pandyas. But the restlessness and the dispossession that visited Ramanatha made him desperate. Having lost Kananur for good to the Pandyas, there was no place that he could call home. Maybe because he had inherited the troublesome part of the empire, maybe because all the wealth was still in Dwara-Samudra, and considering his lot in life to be completely unfair, he decided to attack his brother's territory. The first evidence that a battle happened between the brothers was on a Veera Kallu, or a hero stone, and that dated back to 1260 AD, and it commemorated the death of important soldiers, probably generals, and I quote, "When the Pratapa Chakravartin Hoysala Veera Narasimha Devaraya was ruling the kingdom of the world, when he was fighting with Ramanatha Devaraya, in a battle between elephants, Kembalasetti, who had many children, fought Honnaya and ascended to the world of gods." You'd think that a record of battle between two Hoysala kings would become the focal point of the record, rather than be a placeholder to record the death of other soldiers. And besides, we don't know what came of this battle. Well, this is only another example of the imprecise and whimsical way in which our history has been recorded, and you get a sense of what epigraphists have had to contend with. Now let's flip this to Narasimha's point of view. His reign was troubled. First, the attacks from his brother were incessant. Not only did one battle happen, the one I spoke about, in 1260, but again in 1278, 1280, 1282, 1289, and 1290. There were probably more, but in each of these inscriptions, it was very clear that Ramanatha was the assailant. If fighting one's brother for 3 decades was not enough, Narasimha III was also constantly besieged by the Sevanas at the other end of the kingdom. These attacks did not really result in the loss of the kingdom or any loss of royal life, but they're great raw material for historians to tell stories. For example, one account has the Sevana king Mahadeva mounting an attack on Narasimha. In 1271, he marched on his elephant towards Dwara-Samudra, but the elephant and subsequently a horse got scared and wouldn't move an inch. The inscription at Nagamangala describes this escapade in this way. The great Sevana king Mahadeva marching to battle without fear on his elephant, it being unable to stand, left it and then took his fine horse. Now the inscription goes on to say how the horse got scared and then Mahadeva left his cavalry behind and fled the scene, abandoning the battle. In a testament to Mahadeva's sense of pragmatism, the inscription hilariously suggested that the king had said to himself, "Vedare palayanam kushalam endu iradta odiddane ondu ratriyol." This is old Kannada for scared. He told himself that to run away was best, and he ran away in a single night. There's no respect for deserters, I suppose. Things only got worse between the brothers. Sometime in 1280, there were 2 factions in Odisha who had historical connections with the Hoysalas, and each took sides with each of the brothers. In 1280, Ramanatha, in cahoots with one of them, the Gajapatis, launched a major invasion on his brother. He met Narasimha's forces at Solayur. This is likely somewhere in the Tumakuru district. The battle at Solayur ended in a victory for Ramanatha, and a peace treaty seemed to have followed. As a result, much of Narasimha's eastern territories passed into Ramanatha's hands. But the rivalry didn't end there. In 1282, they fought again, and then again in 1289. Ramanatha waged another war over Bettadakotte. A year later, while Narasimha was at Dorasamudra, Ramanatha raised an army and then marched, probably right up to the city gates. Now, we don't know what came of this battle again, but the next year, Narasimha died, and the conflicts continued. Narasimha's son Ballala III took the throne, and though Ramanatha kept up his attacks, especially in the Bangalore region, Ballala was too strong. Ramanatha launched assaults in 1292, 1294, 1295, but each and every time he failed to gain ground. And then in 1295, Ramanatha died. 4 years later, Ballala absorbed all his lands and became the undisputed ruler of the Hoysalas once again. Earlier, by 1293, Ramanatha had already fallen ill. He lingered for over 2 years before his death in 1295, and after that, his name simply vanishes from recorded history. And this was the end of the warring brothers and the rise of the last king of the Hoysalas, Veera Ballala III. When I come back, how Veera Ballala united the empire and the trajectory of his rule right up to the end of the mighty Hoysalas when they fell to the Sultanate. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hello, I'm back, and I'm glad to see you're still here. Well, to continue. Veera Ballala III was about 28 when he took the throne. His reign would turn out to be the longest in the dynasty's history, but the last. His own life, his youth, his prime, his slow decline, and his death mirrors in many ways the final struggle and collapse of the Hoysalas themselves. It never fails to surprise that so much could hinge on the character of a single ruler, but in Ballala's case, personality was everything. Looking back, it almost feels as though the entire momentum of his dynasty had run its course through him, and with his sudden and agonizing end, the family itself came to a close. But was it an ending as abrupt as it was dramatic? Well, dynasties don't necessarily fall in neat patterns, and in the case of the Hoysalas, for all their attempts at glory, they were simply tired, exhausted. And the one truism in history has always been, no matter how much it seems like a kingdom can last forever, they are never permanent. Almost as soon as Ballala was on the throne, he was put to the test. To begin with, his uncle Ramanatha was still alive and still causing a great deal of trouble. The trouble started even on the day of his coronation. It was 31st of January 1292, when a feudatory caused a skirmish that needed immediate attention. This was not a major campaign, but it gave Ramanatha an opening to increase his territory, and then there was more and more trouble. It was in this year that he invaded and occupied territories in the South Bengaluru district, and that included a lot of the Bengaluru and Tumakuru districts. Now, he made incursions into his nephew's territory, refused to accept the nephew's royal titles, and was all set to make a nuisance of himself. While his efforts were not wanting, he did meet his match in his nephew, who blunted his force, even though Ramanatha had advanced all the way to Hinjiru, which is present-day Hangal. But all that came to pass, and in 1295, Ramanatha died. And his son Vishwanatha was crowned king of Ramanatha's territories. Only 3 years later, we find no further mention of Vishwanatha. One thought is that he didn't really agree with his grandfather splitting the kingdom and let the kingdom merge back into the single unit that it was. And some say that he was imprisoned. But there is no evidence that Ballala fought Vishwanatha. But however it happened, the entire Hoysala kingdom now came into the possession of Veera Ballala III. The 14th century had begun, and in 1301, Ballala set about unifying the kingdom. In that year, he famously sent out an edict written in Tamil to all the religious centers across that area and absolved them of all taxes. The inscription found in Malur read, "We have granted with the pouring of water the taxes on the dry and wet lands in the services of God." For the benefit of ourselves and our kingdom, we are pleased to see that the worship, offerings of rice, enjoyments, and temple repairs are adequately provided for, and pray for our prosperity. There was no better way to win over the hearts and minds of the people than making grants to temples. This masterstroke of diplomacy brought him acceptance across the land. The next decade saw Veera Ballala engaged in putting an end to the Sevana threat. After quelling some minor revolts in the southwestern part of the kingdom, the major battle with the Sevanas happened in 1305. In that year, Ballala marched against the Sevana king, and this was likely Shankaradeva, who responded with a bold battle order: "Go capture the king of the Karnatas and bring me that tiger cub." The tiger cub was an underestimation of Ballala. The battle happened between generals Somaya Danayaka for the Hoysalas and Kampila Deva for the Sevanas, and when the battle ended, Kampila lay on the ground as dead as the Sevana ambitions to unseat Ballala. There were other smaller battles and skirmishes that happened with Ballala's neighbors, and while Ballala was dominant in these efforts, he had made enemies. Rather than co-opt feudatories to his side, he decided to rule them, and this was in hindsight something that would cost Ballala dearly when the Sultanate attacked. So many things happened in the years between 1310 and the end of Veera Ballala's reign in 1342, and those 3 decades were a blur of events that changed the course of history. In the cusp of the 13th and 14th century, there was the rise of the Delhi Sultanate, founded by the Turkish people. Let's get a tiny refresher on them and how they came to play a dominant role in our history. We did learn much of this in our high school history, but who remembers? The Delhi Sultanate emerged after the Ghurid, that's Ghazni and importantly Ghuri invasions, when Qutbuddin Aibak, a former slave who had turned general, had taken control of Delhi and founded a new ruling dynasty. Over 3 centuries, the Sultanate was ruled by that and 4 other dynasties. And here they are. The Mamluks, starting in 1206 under Qutbuddin Aibak, they built Delhi, and importantly, they built the Qutub Minar. And then in 1290, the Khalijis took over from them, and it was Allauddin Khilji who decided to expand the empire to the south. And this is the period that we will discuss in the balance of this episode. They were followed by the Tughlaqs in 1320, the Saids from 1414, and then in 1451, the Lodhis. The Sultanate was finally defeated by Babur in 1526, and that opened the Mughal era. The Delhi Sultans had heard of the Deccan for its wealth, its resources, and its strategic value, and of course, they wanted to plunder it. Allauddin Khilji was the first to act. He got the permission of his uncle the king, Jalaluddin, for a southern push. And then by 1309, Allauddin Khilji handpicked his general Malik Kafur for this campaign to go south. Over the next few years, Kafur led devastating campaigns across the Deccan, subdued the Kakatiyas of Warangal, the Hoysalas and the Pandyas, and these conquests brought immense wealth to Delhi and marked the Sultanate's first real control over the Deccan. Now let's see how it played out. There is a compelling description of the long march of Kafur from Delhi to the south, a journey that took from 17th of November 1310 when he left Delhi and 3rd February 1311 when the army reached the Yadava capital Devagiri. Malik Kafur appeared to have received little resistance on the way, but importantly a lot of support on the journey. Prataparudra, the Kakatiya king out of Warangal, sent 23 elephants. And when Kafur reached Devagiri, the king Ramachandra laid out a grand welcome. The account of Amir Khusro described how the bazaars of the city were decked out and organized by merchant category to cater to the army of the Turks. And after 3 to 4 days of bonhomie and camaraderie between the Turkish army and the Yadava men, the campaign to take the Hoysala dynasty was afoot. Meanwhile, in the Pandya kingdom, Sundara Pandya had murdered his father, and then he turned to Veera Ballala for help against his brother Veera Pandyan. In return, the Hoysalas would get back the territory of Kananur. Veera Ballala, ever the opportunist, decided that he would use this occasion to turn the tide against both brothers, and then he set out with his army to the Pandya lands. But he had to rush back when he learned of the threat from the Sultanate. That's because Malik Kafur had handpicked a force of 10,000 men from his staging area in Devagiri, which is present-day Daulatabad, and he took 12 days to reach Samudra, present-day Halebeedu again. It was a distance of over 800 kilometers. And he made good time because he wanted the element of surprise and not let Ballala prepare for battle. And on 26 February 1311, Kafur surrounded the Samudra fort. Ballala sent his scout Gesumal to assess the threat. Now, according to Khusru, who could not possibly have known for sure, Gesumal returned to report that the fort would be flattened like a prayer rug if an attack were to take place. The only reference to any resistance was from a 1310 inscription that read, "The Turks, having marched against Samudra, Bachaya Nayaka, son of Nadeguru Machaya Nayaka of Dudda, displayed a bravery that was admired in both armies." We can't really tell what manner of skirmish there was that caused this young man to lose his life, but it didn't have the ring of a major battle. Maybe it was a minor clash that bound to happen when forces are in the same vicinity. Nonetheless, Gesumal's assessment of the situation seems to have been accepted, and the next morning, officials from the Hoysala court emerged to signal Ballala's surrender. There were no negotiations to speak of. It is said that Ballala sent word to Kafur that he was prepared to give away everything he had except the sacred thread that he wore. It took 2 days and 2 nights for the Sultan's forces to remove the treasures from the fort, and then there was an incident when some of the Sultanate forces had overheard an argument between 2 court officials. When these 2 officials were brought before Kafur and their lives threatened, they gave up the location, 7 more places where there was buried treasure, and all this was gathered and taken back to Delhi. To get a sense of the loot that Malik Kafur carried back to his emperor in Delhi, here's the description. He presented the king with 312 elephants, 20,000 horses, 96,000 maunds of gold, several boxes of jewels and pearls and other precious effects. A maund in the medieval Deccan could have been anything upwards of 11 kilos, so at the very least they had carried back over a ton of gold. In addition, Ballala agreed to pay an annual tribute or zimma in the Sultanate parlance, and Ballala's son was taken hostage for a couple of years, but he was returned in 1313. Ballala and the Deccan had not seen before a military machine of this dimension, and without time to prepare, to gear up and to meet the new challenge, they were powerless. And although he continued to remain king, Ballala was reduced to being a vassal of Allauddin Khilji, the Sultan of Delhi. And no longer will we refer to the Hoysalas as a proud sovereign nation, for the Hoysala Empire, as we have known it, was done. In the next episode, I will walk you through the balance of Ballala's time till his death and the rise of the Vijayanagara Empire. And in a surprising twist to the tale, the romance between Allauddin Khilji's daughter and Veera Ballala. Simply being human? Find out in the next episode. More stories coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.